Question A2. Okay, it's asking you to write a method, it's asking you to write code. Okay, now when you write a method, the first thing to think of, what are the arguments to this method? What is its return type? Equals is called on an object with another object as its argument. Okay, be very careful. It doesn't take two objects as its arguments, it takes one and it's called on the other. A lot of people make the mistake thinking equals must take two equals objects. It takes one and it's called on the other. That's important. Now, what it must be public. It returns a boolean. Okay, now we want equals in class cell, but slightly oddly, and it is explained in my notes, we need to give it parameter type object. Why do we need to give it parameter type object? That's because it's overriding the equals method inherited from object. It must have object. Now we're going to cast that to a cell because this is going to be called on a cell object. So what we've got here is cell 1 equals cell 2, where cell 1 and cell 2 are two variables of type cell. It doesn't actually matter what their element type is. I'll make it generic. Okay, now the default of equals is these two will be equal only if they're aliases, but we want them to be equal if they're two separate objects whose contents are equal. So the first field must be equal. And the next field must be equal. Now, we've got recursion here. The next field is of type cell, so the next field for equal will use the same equals method as here. Recursion is another concept which people often find tricky. So we'll assume that these will refer to further cells and that they're all going to have equal content. Okay, now how do we deal with this? First of all, although the argument type is object, it's only going to be equal, a cell is only equal to another cell if it takes an argument of type cell. If it's not equal to a cell, we return false. Now we need to cast this to make it into a cell. To use the variable name that when we got an object of the same type as it's being called. Remember, this is inside class cell. We're adding this to the class cell which was given on the paper. Okay, now, and this refers to the object that it's called on. So in this case, cell 1 will be this, and cell 2 is that. Okay, now, what are they equal? Well, they're equal if the first are equal and yeah, the first are equal and the next are equal. Okay. So if the first of the this and that are not equal, the two lists are not equal, we can return false. Without any further checking, we don't need to go further than this. Okay, now, but they're only equal, the next are also equal, but that's a recursive call, so if the next are equal, then the whole thing is equal. Some people get worried about this because it's calling equals. How does that work? It will use the same code that we've got here, but it's a separate method call. It will compare the next of these two cells, not the same. So don't worry, it will work because it's the same code but different arguments. So this whole thing will work. It's a complete definition of equals. That's the answer to this problem. If it seems complex at first, try writing this code for yourself, running it, see how it works. You probably wouldn't get this exact same question in a future exam. You may get something very similar. You would have more confidence in understanding it if you've had confidence in writing and running your own code to understand how this works. Here was my solution for question 2, my first attempt, and looking back at it, I see I've actually made several mistakes on it. The first one is I didn't give this method a name. It's meant to be an equals method, so of course it must have the name equals. Okay, I was concerned about the parameter types and the return type, but I had to give it a name. It has to be equals, you've got to override the objects equal. Well, that's the first mistake I saw in it. What's the second mistake I saw in it? I'm looking, remember, next is a variable, okay, so it's not a method. I've been inconsistent. I put these brackets around here. I can close brackets. That's how you make a method call, but next is not a method call, it's a variable. It's a common mistake I often see, and you see I've made it myself without thinking I'm confusing variables and methods, so that, I can't get rid of that. But that should just be next without the brackets. Okay, so that's a second mistake. This next equals that next. No brackets. Third mistake is I didn't take account of what if next either of these next, this next and that next is null. If I can't call a method on null because null means nothing. So I really should have here if they're both null, equal. So we only get to the next bit if it's not because of both. If one is null or the other is null, then they're not equal, must return false. Okay, now that's looking more like a correct answer. Okay, so the point here is, when I was answering this question on video, doing it quickly, I made some silly mistakes. It's very easy to do that. When I looked back to review the video the next day, I thought, I made a silly mistake here. I've not taken into account, I've not put this, I've not put the name in. Therefore, I've lost marks. Now, in an exam situation, if I had time to go back and review that, hopefully I would have spotted that, corrected this, and got full marks for it. So, how would I mark myself if my marks here had been for the original answer? A minor but silly mistake to miss out the name of the method. Another minor, very easy mistake made. Missing out the actual null case is perhaps a more serious error. If this was a 5-mark question, if the sense of the answer is there. If I saw this answer as it was originally, I think, yeah, the person understands what they're doing. They've made a few silly mistakes, but they understand it. It's not 5 out of 5, it's probably 4 out of 5. I think 3 out of 5 for saying, which is essentially correct, but a few silly mistakes would be too harsh. I think as a marker I would have given this 4 out of 5. So it's just to say, yeah, we do make silly mistakes, but I don't mark harshly for silly mistakes. If the answer shows reasonable understanding of what it should be, but there are silly mistakes, you will still get a reasonable mark. So don't be too concerned about that. But to get full marks, you need to be fully correct. Go back and check your answers to make sure you've done. There we are.